Hello, I'm Don Greer. I'm a facilitator and a system modeler with the Rapid City Collective Impact. This video is the first in a series in which we share elements of city dynamics as it relates to Rapid City. Today's video will be looking at the foundational elements of the model. To begin with, this form of modeling is called system dynamics, and the icon structure that we use is similar to bathtubs. So, for example, each of the squares represent an accumulation, just like a bathtub has with water. You have an inflow into the tub, and you have an outflow, being the drain of the tub. And the little red symbols here represent the spigot that controls the rate of flow through the pipe. So you can think of this if there's nothing draining out here and then you have an inflow, then you'd expect an accumulation to go up. And if you turn this off and turn this one on, you'd expect that accumulation to go down. And if you have both going on at the same time, the level will be the net difference between those two elements in time. And in this case, we're thinking about underemployed housing, for example. So we could have an increase in underemployed housing, and then, of course, demolition would reduce the stock that we have of underemployed housing. The little blobs on the ends of the arrows represent clouds. They are a way of representing the boundaries of the model, saying that we don't know where these things come from on the input side, and we don't care where these things go on the output side. And they basically say, here's the boundaries of the model. So with that, I'll begin walking through some of the foundational elements here. This basic chain here at the bottom represents the productive unit structure that we have in Rapid City. We have new enterprises, we have mature businesses, and we have declining industry. And this really represents an aging chain that businesses or productive units, no matter what you might call them, go through. There's an initial phase of high growth where employment within the organization is very high. And then as it matures, usually a period of 8 to 10 years, they move into the mature business phase, which has slightly fewer employees, but still fairly active and has a long period of time. Most productive units will stay in that stage probably for 10 to 25 years. And then at some point they move to declining industry in which they age gracefully. Now you can identify structures in the declining industry space. As if you're driving around Rapid City, you may see older buildings that are used for warehouses. Maybe it was a gas station before and now it's storage for something. Or you'll see buildings that are repurposed. Maybe a startup is in an old warehouse area. So this is an indication that that structure itself is part of the declining industry. But that said, if you have a young startup, many startups start off in these declining industry spaces because they're inexpensive. But once they get going and they are able to stabilize themselves, then they can afford to build something for themselves that's unique and for them, and that'll put them in the new enterprise category. With the passage of time, all these productive units will move through this chain. There is no way to avoid that. And similarly, up here in the housing chain, we have premium housing, worker housing, and underemployed housing. And this represents the escalator, if you will, of housing as it moves probably with about 30 years time from premium housing to worker housing, and then over and up perhaps another 20 years it'll move to underemployed housing. And in this particular chain you have the lowest number of people per housing unit over in the premium side, and as you move this direction the number of people per housing unit actually increases. The density of people in the household increases as you move this way. And then within the house we have the workforce. You have underemployed people, which are either unemployed or they can be working below living wage. Labor is those working at living wage or higher, and of course managerial professional are well above living wage. And people can move from being underemployed, using this flow here, to labor, and laborers could become unemployed and move back here. So there is a lot of movement of people back and forth here. And also you have an inflow on each of these that is for births. If you're born into a family that is at a particular stage, typically that's the stage where you're going to begin your life also. So we have accounting for birth rate here. People can leave Rapid City and people can arrive in Rapid City from all of these stages. And so this represents the chain of people in Rapid City. The model itself is really built upon these fundamental structures and how they interact with each other. So the managerial professional, for example, these are the people that tend to start businesses. So this is a population that typically would live in premium housing, but they're also the ones that start new enterprises. On this end, you have underemployeds, which typically live in underemployed housing, and they struggle in the declining industry space. So everyone is seeking to move this way in the model, but the passage of time tends to push everybody to the right side of the model. From a tax-based perspective, both premium housing and new enterprise would have the highest taxable value, and then as you move to the right, the underemployed housing and the declining industry has the least taxable value. So you could see if a city were to have accumulations that were mostly on the right-hand side, you'd have a relatively low tax base. And if you had a population that was mostly on the right side, you'd have a very high tax expenditure need. And in many cases, that happens in cities where they become stagnant or they've become aged, and there hasn't been a whole lot of new enterprise creation for some period of time. They end up in a situation where they have low tax income and high tax demand, which would be what happens when everything is shifted to the right. So with that, that is the beginning of our series and the foundational elements for understanding Rapid City dynamics. Later in the series, we'll be looking at various options for intervening in policy for Rapid City, and we'll investigate what's the impact of trying some of those options and what that might look like. Thank you.